Okay, I'm going to try to go through and review this worksheet on the Keynesian model, mostly jiving it with the aggregate supply, aggregate demand curve that we hopefully already understand. Consider maybe after I do this first example, it might be a little bit easier than you thought it would. And if you kind of looked at the worksheet and said, what the heck is this? Consider after an example or two, maybe pausing the video, going back and giving it another try. Okay, and again, we're going to learn that though it's relatively complicated, we are okay working with a relatively basic understanding of this. Okay, all right. So having said that, I think that this was page 1. So if this is our aggregate supply, aggregate demand curve here, we see a decrease in aggregate demand. Where would we be first off on a business cycle, and where would we be on our Keynesian cross? Okay, obviously we know that we're somewhere, we're somewhere around here in a recessionary gap, and on a Keynesian cross, it is as simple as this. This is aggregate expenditures, CIGXN, or CIG since we're kind of keeping it more basic, and as a whole, aggregate expenditures are down. Okay, so now we see, this certainly takes that whole complicated thing and makes it look a lot simpler. Okay, so, for the first page, here's really the answer. Here is your recessionary gap. And of course, you can see, by the way, here, you can see here's that point of saving. People are spending less money than they're taking in, or than they plan to take in during a recession. Okay, so there's page 1. And hopefully we see how simple some of this can be. Okay. Oh, goodness gracious. The economy had long-term growth, which lowered prices and increased output. Okay, well, this says a lot, and this kind of is going to make things really complicated in a way if you overthink them. First thing is it lowered prices, which is great, but we know that this doesn't really take prices into account. So we're not going to see anything about prices here, but one thing that we see here is that long-run aggregate supply increased because we had real deal, actual great economic growth. So that essentially means that on this graph, full employment has increased. Basically the same thing as long-run aggregate supply, and it increased output. Okay, so this is showing the increase in output, and along with that, we're assuming that people are buying this increased output. So if we're still at equilibrium with that new economic growth, this is what it would look like. Okay, it's worth pointing out those times when we're looking at a graph which is like the economics dream come true, real actual economic growth, and here's what it would look like on our corresponding graphs. All right, next one. What would an increase in aggregate demand look like? Okay, so if we started at equilibrium and we entered an inflationary gap, which we know is right there. Right now, aggregate demand is higher than we can sustain in the long term. So that means that our aggregate expenditure is greater than we can sustain in the long term. Here is that area of savings, and here is our current equilibrium. Not that bad once we get going. All right, here is an aggregate supply, aggregate demand model in perfect equilibrium. And I'm just basically asking you here is like, where would the magic full employment line look like to take this graph and put it at equilibrium? Hopefully we understand that just means that full employment, that might not be perfectly vertical, but that full employment would be right there. Okay, that's basically what I was asking for there. Not bad at all. All right. So again, if we really can kind of correspond this graph along with the aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph, as well as understand a couple of those keywords that I introduced to you: disposable income, autonomous consumption, aggregate expenditure, gives us a better idea of marginal propensity to consume. All of those things are what we can get out of this graph. But in the big scheme of things, it's not too difficult. All right, next one. Show an increase in government spending that would bring us this economy to equilibrium. So here we've simplified things. We looked at, this is aggregate expenditure, which is C plus I plus G. And if we were including XN, it would be in there also. Now we know that when an economy is in a recessionary gap, like if we were here, or I guess we would say like the economy is in now, we know that the government wants to spend money to stimulate. So we know that increases aggregate demand, and that will increase aggregate expenditure, which is that combination of C plus I plus G. So now I'm going to try to draw this line to, parallel. But, if the government actually does a great job and brings us right back to perfect equilibrium, this would be that, that effect graphically. All right. Next one. Okay, fill in the two blanks to identify the curves between. Okay, oh, goodness gracious. This probably should have been the first page. Okay, so we know that this is consumption and this is our total aggregate expenditure. So it's C plus investment plus government. And I guess this really would be aggregate expenditure unless this was trade. So actually it was a bad question, but you get the point, I hope. All right, this economy, what is it in right now? Okay, so we should know that this is right now.